What would you do if the people who once cast you aside suddenly needed you? Family is supposed to be unconditional, but what happens when they see you as nothing more than a business transaction? When success turns the tables, do you forgive, or do you make them face the consequences of their choices? Welcome to AGS Stories, where real stories of betrayal, resilience, and redemption come to life. Don't forget to subscribe to the channel, and let's dive into today's gripping tale. I stood at the foot of the steps, staring up at the house I once called home. It looked exactly the same. Pristine white columns, the porch lights casting a warm, inviting glow, the perfectly trimmed hedges framing the grand entrance like something out of a magazine. A picture of success, at least on the outside. But I knew better. I knew what lay behind that door. The weight of expectation, the sharp edges of judgment, the suffocating pressure to be someone I never was and never wanted to be. My phone buzzed in my hand. I glanced down, and there it was, another notification from my business account. An order just came in, another six-figure sale, another confirmation that I made the right choice. I exhaled slowly, dragging a hand over my jaw. The irony wasn't lost on me. 3 months ago, this family had made it crystal clear that I didn't belong. They had sat me down, handed me a stack of legal documents, and with the cold efficiency of a corporate transaction, cut me out of their lives. And now they needed me. Funny how life worked. The text from my father had been short, clipped, as if extending the invitation had physically pained him. Family meeting, 7 p.m., non-negotiable, just like old times, dictating terms without asking, assuming I would fall in line like I always had before. I should have ignored it. I could have ignored it, but I didn't. I was here. For a long moment, I just stood there, my fingers tightening around my phone. The last time I'd walked through that door, I had left with nothing, not even my name, as far as they were concerned. I had let the door close behind me, their voices still ringing in my ears, telling me I was making the biggest mistake of my life, telling me I was throwing everything away. And yet here I was, not just standing, but thriving. My business, my so-called hobby, my so-called little side project had exploded. What started as a personal passion had become an empire, a movement, a force bigger than I had ever imagined. While they had spent their lives chasing traditional success, I had built something with my own hands. And now, the people who had written me off, who had thrown me away, suddenly had their hands out. I inhaled sharply, shaking off the thought. This wasn't about proving them wrong. It wasn't even about proving myself right. It was about one thing: closure. Before I could knock, the door swung open. My mother stood there, the same pressed lips, the same steely eyes that I had spent my childhood trying to impress. She looked me over, scanning me like she was assessing whether I was worth letting in. Her gaze flickered, just briefly, to the watch on my wrist, the one I had bought for myself when I hit my first million. "You're late," she said. I glanced at my watch. 6:58 p.m. Something's never changed. I stepped past her into the house, and the silence that followed was deafening. They were all there, waiting, just like I knew they would be. My father stood by the fireplace, hands clasped behind his back, his posture rigid, the weight of the family name hanging over him like an invisible cloak. My sister, ever the lawyer, sat on the leather sofa, a briefcase at her feet, because even in a family intervention, there had to be paperwork. My younger brother barely looked up from his phone, pretending he wasn't as invested as the rest of them. The setup was familiar, like something out of a movie. An intervention, a tribunal, a reckoning. For a second, the memory of the last time I sat in this room came rushing back. The stack of papers on the coffee table, the cold professionalism with which they had informed me that I was no longer part of the Gonzalez family. How they had said it wasn't personal, just business. How my mother had sat there, watching, silent, as they dismantled me like an investment gone bad. And yet here we were. I could feel their eyes on me, weighing, measuring, judging still. But this time, something was different. This time, I wasn't the one on trial. I slipped my hands into my pockets, scanning their faces, letting the silence stretch just a little too long, letting the discomfort settle. Then I smirked. "So," I said, my voice easy, casual, the way a man speaks when he knows he has nothing to lose. What's this about? My father exhaled through his nose, that familiar sound of disapproval. Sit down, Paul. I stayed standing. Let's skip the part where we pretend this is about family, I said. Why don't you tell me what's really going on? My sister cleared her throat, reaching down to unclasp her briefcase. My mother shifted uncomfortably, looking away. My father's jaw tightened. I already knew the answer. The business was in trouble. They wouldn't have called me otherwise. Funny, really. The last time I was here, they had made sure I left with nothing. No inheritance, no support, no connection to the family legacy. And now they wanted something from me. I bit back a laugh, shaking my head. The tables had turned. My father squared his shoulders. This isn't about the past, he said, his voice clipped. It's about the future. The dealership is... I held up a hand, stopping him mid-sentence. Save it. I wasn't here to be guilt. I wasn't here to be manipulated. I was here to listen, to hear just how far they had fallen. And then I would decide if they were even worth saving. The weight of their expectations, their judgment, their disapproval, it didn't matter anymore. I wasn't the failure they had cast out. I wasn't the disappointment they had tried to erase. I was Paul Gonzalez, and this time I was the one holding all the cards. I leaned back in my chair, arms crossed over my chest, as my father took his usual stance by the fireplace, the same position he always assumed before delivering some grand decree. The room was the same, the players unchanged, but the energy was different now. The last time I was here, I was a failure in their eyes, a disgrace, the family disappointment. Now, they needed me. But before I could savor that irony, before I could fully appreciate the power shift, the past came rushing back, the weight of all the years leading to this moment. Success in my family was not an option, it was a duty. My father, Richard Gonzalez, had built his legacy brick by brick, oil change by oil change, until his name was etched in steel across half the luxury car dealerships in the state. He wasn't just a businessman. He was a man obsessed with power, prestige, and reputation. To him, the Gonzalez name meant something. It was a brand, and we as children were expected to protect, uphold, and expand that brand. My mother, Evelyn, played her part just as flawlessly. She wasn't just his wife. She was the image of class and propriety, a walking PR campaign. She orchestrated charity events, mingled with the right people, and made sure we were seen, but only in the right circles. Then there was my sister, Vanessa, the golden child, the perfect product of their creation. At 36, she had become one of the most sought-after corporate attorneys in the city, winning cases and securing deals that kept our family's name polished and untouchable. She carried herself with the kind of authority that only comes from knowing you're never questioned. And then there was my younger brother, Eric, the genius. He was the one with the degrees, the research grants, the medical accolades that my parents paraded around like trophies. And then there was me, the outlier, the one who didn't fit the mold. From the moment I was old enough to understand how this family worked, I knew I was different. I didn't want boardrooms and mergers. I didn't care about handshakes and stage photo ops. I wanted to create. While my siblings were excelling in classrooms, I was sneaking into my grandfather's old tool shed, running my fingers over raw wood, turning scraps into sculptures, bending metal into something new. It fascinated me, the idea that something discarded could become beautiful again. My father saw it as a problem, a weakness. At 22, I was supposed to follow the blueprint. I had enrolled in business school, doing exactly what was expected of me. But every lecture, every case study, every moment spent in that world felt like a slow suffocation. Then, during my junior year, I made a decision that would change everything. I dropped out. I took the little money I had saved, rented a tiny workshop on the outskirts of town, and started my own business. Not a car dealership, not a law firm, but a studio. I built furniture from reclaimed materials, turned discarded glass into art, transformed forgotten wood into statement pieces. And I loved it. But my family? They hated it. I'll never forget that dinner. The night I told them. My father set down his glass of wine with a calculated slowness, his expression unreadable, but his disappointment thick enough to choke on. "You're throwing your future away," he said, each word like a gavel hitting wood. My mother reached for her pearls, a nervous habit. Paul, sweetheart, this is a phase, right? You're not actually walking away from your education. Vanessa smirked behind her wine glass, already preparing her next cutting remark. Eric didn't even look up from his phone, but I held my ground. I'm not walking away from anything, I said. I'm building something of my own. Vanessa laughed. You mean you're making trinkets? My father's hand clenched into a fist on the table. You're embarrassing yourself. And worse, you're embarrassing this family. I'm doing something that actually matters. I snapped, anger rising in my chest. I'm creating something from nothing, giving materials a second life. You're playing with glue and glitter. He cut me off. Like a damn child, I remember the heat rushing to my face. The frustration. The realization that no matter what I did, I would never be enough for them. I looked at my mother then, silently begging for some kind of support. But she just shook her head, her eyes filled with something that almost looked like pity. That was the night I stopped trying to belong. For years, I worked in the shadows, grinding, failing, learning, and rebuilding. I took every setback, every struggle, every moment of doubt, and turned it into fuel. Slowly, my business grew. My pieces started getting recognition. One day, a major interior design influencer posted about one of my creations, a coffee table made entirely from salvaged shipwood. Within 24 hours, I had hundreds of orders. Within a year, I was making more than I ever thought possible. And still, my family refused to acknowledge it. At weddings, at holiday gatherings, I was still the black sheep. Vanessa would introduce me as the creative one. My mother would laugh nervously whenever someone asked what I did. My father never brought it up at all, and I didn't care, or at least I told myself I didn't. Until the night they disowned me. It was another family meeting, another performance disguised as a discussion. I sat in the same chair I sat in now, only back then I didn't understand what was coming. Vanessa slid the papers across the table. Formal dissolution of familial ties. Relinquishment of inheritance rights. Termination of family association. I laughed at first. I thought it was a joke, but my father just stared at me, eyes cold. This is for the good of the family, my mother said, her voice steady. They weren't asking me. They were telling me. I picked up the pen. Paul, my mother started, softening, as if she expected me to beg. I didn't. I signed my name, and I walked out of their lives. Or so I thought. I pulled myself from the memory. My jaw clenched. Across the room, Vanessa shifted in her seat, her fingers tapping a rhythm on her briefcase. My father exhaled sharply, bracing himself. I already knew what was coming. They weren't calling me back because they missed me. They weren't calling me back because they realized they had made a mistake. They were calling me back because they needed me. My phone buzzed in my pocket. I pulled it out, glancing down. A text from my father. Family meeting. 7 p.m. Non-negotiable. The exact same words from the last time. But this time, I held the power. The room felt colder than I remembered. Not physically. No, my parents' house was always kept at the perfect temperature, a carefully controlled climate that matched the carefully controlled lives they led. But there was something else in the air that night. Something heavy. Something final. I sat in the same chair I had occupied during countless family discussions. The same chair where I had once been told what my future was supposed to look like. Except this time, I wasn't here to be guided or scolded into compliance. This time, something else was waiting for me. I could see it before Vanessa even reached for her briefcase. A stack of papers. Crisp white. Official. I exhaled slowly, tapping my fingers against my knee as I studied the faces around me. My mother, hands folded neatly in her lap, gaze fixed on the floor. My father, standing by the fireplace, posture stiff as steel. My brother, Eric, scrolling on his phone like he had somewhere better to be. And Vanessa, smoothing out her blazer as she clicked open her case, movements sharp and precise. I was no fool. I knew what this was. Still, I let them speak first. Vanessa cleared her throat, adjusting the papers before her like she was about to present an airtight case in court. Maybe, to her, It's time to be realistic, Paul, she said, her voice cool, professional. You're embarrassing us? I almost laughed. The absurdity of it, the absolute gall. But instead, I leaned back, arms crossed, and raised a brow. Embarrassing you how, exactly? My father was the one who answered. You walked away from the path we set for you. He said, the words clipped, rehearsed. You were given every opportunity, every advantage, and you squandered it. I tilted my head, letting the silence stretch between us before speaking. By building a business from the ground up, by making something with my own hands instead of living off your legacy. This isn't a business, Paul, my father snapped. It's a hobby, a distraction, and you've made it clear you have no interest in being part of this family in any meaningful way. There was the blow that had been waiting to land. Vanessa took that moment to slide the documents toward me, neatly aligning them with the edge of the table, her expression unreadable. We've been discussing the family's future, she said, as if this was just another legal matter. And we've come to a decision, a necessary one. I didn't look at the papers. Not yet. Instead, I turned to my mother. Mom? I asked, waiting for her to meet my gaze. Her lips parted slightly, but no words came out. And that was all I needed to know. My chest felt tight, but my voice was steady when I finally spoke. You're disowning me. Vanessa hesitated, but my father didn't miss a beat. You chose your path, he said simply. Now we're choosing ours. For a moment, there was only silence. I had always known they didn't respect what I did, that they dismissed my work, rolled their eyes behind my back, whispered about how I would come to my senses one day. But this was something else entirely. I let out a slow breath, finally looking down at the papers. The words blurred for a second, but I didn't need to read them to understand. Formal dissolution of familial ties, relinquishment of inheritance rights, termination of family association. So neat, so clinical, as if I was nothing more than an asset being liquidated. Vanessa handed me a pen. I took it without a word. I could feel them watching, waiting for my reaction. Maybe they thought I would beg. Maybe they thought I would fight. I didn't. I pressed the pen to paper and signed my name. The room was so quiet, I could hear the ink drying. I set the pen down, pushed the papers back toward Vanessa, and stood. That was it then. Years of family history, gone with the stroke of a pen. I turned to my father first. He didn't look satisfied or relieved. Just firm, resolved, like he had convinced himself this was right. Eric finally looked up from his phone, but there was no real emotion there. Just mild curiosity, like I was a passing headline, barely worth his time. And my mother, she wasn't crying. She wasn't protesting. She just sat there, staring at a spot on the table, her fingers clutching the pearls around her neck like they were the only thing holding her together. I swallowed hard. I had expected anger, maybe even regret. Instead, all I saw was indifference. And that hurt more than anything else. I took a slow step back, letting my gaze sweep over them one last time, memorizing the way they looked in that moment. They had made their choice, and so had I. Paul, my mother finally spoke, her voice soft, uncertain. If you just... I held up a hand, stopping her. No, I said, my voice firm. You don't get to soften this now. I turned and walked toward the door, my footsteps echoing in the stillness. No one tried to stop me. I reached for the handle, pausing just for a second. Part of me, some stupid part that still clung to the idea of family, of unconditional love, hoped that someone would say something, that someone would break, that someone would tell me I mattered. Even now, I looked over my shoulder, but all I saw were cold stares and straight backs. I clenched my jaw and opened the door. The night air hit me like a slap, sharp and sobering. I stepped out, closing the door behind me with a quiet click. Too quiet, too final. I took a shaky breath and walked down the front steps, my fists tightening at my sides. They thought I would break. They thought this would destroy me. But as I reached my car, my phone buzzed in my pocket. Absent-mindedly, I pulled it out, glancing at the screen. A notification, a business inquiry, a major business inquiry. I frowned, unlocking my phone, scanning the details. A new retailer, a massive order, an opportunity that could change everything. I let out a small, disbelieving laugh. The universe had a hell of a sense of humor. I slid into the driver's seat, gripping the wheel as a slow, defiant smile crept onto my face. Losing them wasn't the end. It was the beginning. The engine hummed beneath my fingers as I gripped the steering wheel, staring at the road ahead. My childhood home faded into the distance in the rearview mirror, swallowed by the night. I didn't look back. I wouldn't let myself. The papers were signed. The words were spoken. The door had closed, and with it, so had any illusions I had left about my place in that family. They made their choice, and now I would make mine. I glanced down at my phone, the business notification still glowing on the screen. A major order, bigger than anything I'd ever received before. A retailer reaching out, interested in my work. Not just any retailer, but one of the biggest names in high-end sustainable home decor. They wanted to talk. They wanted me. I exhaled sharply, my pulse pounding, but not from grief. Not from anger. From something else entirely. Determination. They thought they had cut me off. They thought I would crumble, that without the Gonzalez name, without their resources, I would be nothing. They were wrong. They had just set me free. For the next 6 months, I threw myself into my work like a man possessed. My workshop became my world. Sawdust in the air, the scent of stain wood clinging to my clothes, the constant hum of machinery filling the silence where my family's voices used to be. I worked through the nights, fueled by caffeine and pure defiance, sketching designs, refining my craft, making sure that every single piece I put out into the world wasn't just good, it was undeniable. Orders trickled in at first. Then they started piling up. The retailer who had reached out after that night, they placed a test order, 5 statement pieces for an exclusive collection. I poured everything into them, and when those pieces sold out in 2 days, they came back with a bigger order. 20 pieces, then 50. Then other retailers noticed. Then the magazines. The first time I saw my work featured in Modern Living magazine, I almost didn't believe it. My hands shook as I held the glossy pages, flipping to the full-page spread. Paul Gonzalez, the artist turning discarded materials into luxury home design. The photos showed my work in all its detail. A coffee table made from salvaged shipwood, a chandelier crafted from reclaimed metal, a sculpture pieced together from forgotten fragments of glass. A story about transformation, about taking something unwanted and making it valuable again. I stared at my name in bold letters and let out a breath I hadn't realized I was holding. Not once in my life had I seen the Gonzalez name in print without my father's dealership attached to it. But this was mine. The demand surged overnight. My inbox flooded with orders, each one bigger than the last. Designers, luxury hotels, even private collectors wanted my work. I had to hire help, 3 assistants, then 5, then an entire production team. I moved into a bigger studio, then 2. My monthly revenue hit 6 figures. Then, before I even had time to process it, 7. I wasn't just surviving. I was thriving. And the most satisfying part? I had done it without them. No family name, no inheritance, no connections. Just me. 6 months after they disowned me, I stood in the middle of a luxury design gallery in New York, my work displayed under glowing spotlights, champagne glasses clinking around me. People circled my installations, murmuring their admiration. A well-known designer leaned into a buyer and whispered, "This guy? He's the future." I let the words sink in. But even as I smiled and shook hands, a part of me still ached. Not because I missed them, but because I knew that if they had supported me from the start, if they had believed in me the way these strangers did, they would be here. They would see this. But they weren't. They had chosen not to be. And yet, even as that thought crossed my mind, even as I let myself feel that sting of abandonment, my phone buzzed in my pocket. I pulled it out, expecting another business inquiry. But it wasn't. It was a name I never thought I'd see on my screen again. Vanessa. My heart pounded, but not from excitement. I let the phone ring until it stopped. Then it buzzed again, this time a text. "Paul, we need to talk." I stared at the message, my jaw tightening. Not "we miss you." Not "we were wrong." Just "we need to talk." I exhaled through my nose and locked the screen, slipping the phone back into my pocket. They had made their choice. And now, I had mine. The message sat on my screen, the words staring back at me like ghosts from a past I thought I had buried. "Paul, we need to talk." I should have ignored it. I should have left it unread, let it fade into the same oblivion where my family had once tried to send me. But curiosity, that dangerous little thing, whispered in my ear. So I replied, "Meet me at Lawn, tomorrow, 8 p.m. No pleasantries, no explanations, just a location and a time." I didn't expect them to agree, but they did. And that's how, 6 months after they disowned me, I found myself sitting in the private dining room of one of the most exclusive restaurants in the city, waiting for the family who had once decided I wasn't worth keeping. This time, I had picked the setting. This time, I was the one in control. The hostess escorted them in promptly at 8 p.m. My father first, his usual commanding presence slightly dimmed, my mother behind him, clutching her purse like it held the last remnants of her dignity. Vanessa entered next, her expression carefully neutral, but I could see the tension in her jaw. Eric wasn't there. I didn't blame him. He had never been the one pulling the strings. Mr. Gonzalez, the maitre d', greeted me, a subtle nod of respect in his voice. That alone was enough to make my father blink. Mr. Gonzalez, not Richard Gonzalez's son, not the black sheep of the family. Just me. I stood as they reached the table, buttoning my jacket with a slow, deliberate movement. "Please," I gestured to the seats. "Make yourselves comfortable." They hesitated, and for a brief moment, I saw something almost comical in their faces. This was unfamiliar territory. I wasn't sitting in their house, waiting to be judged. I wasn't at their table, hoping for approval. This was my domain. They were the ones coming to me, and they knew it. My father cleared his throat as they took their seats. "Paul," he started. I lifted a hand. "Let's order first," I said smoothly, signaling the waiter. I took the liberty of having a tasting menu prepared. Lawn specializes in sustainable ingredients, locally sourced. Thought you might appreciate that. A flicker of recognition crossed my mother's face. "You invest in this place, don't you?" she asked softly. I didn't respond. She already knew the answer. The wine was poured. The first course arrived. Exquisite, delicate plates of artfully plated food. My father barely touched his. He was here for one reason, and it wasn't to enjoy the meal. Finally, he exhaled. "We need your help, son." I set my glass down, tilting my head. "Son?" I echoed. That's interesting, because I could have sworn 6 months ago I wasn't family anymore. Vanessa sighed, rubbing her temples. "Paul, don't do this." "Oh, I'm sorry," I said, feigning confusion. "Are we not acknowledging what happened? Because I seem to remember sitting in your living room while you slid legal papers across the table, telling me I was no longer a Gonzalez." My father's jaw tightened. "We made a mistake." I leaned back, crossing my arms. "No," I said simply. "You made a choice." Silence. A long, weighted pause. And then, finally, my mother spoke, her voice softer than I had ever heard it. "The dealership is failing." Of course it was. I had seen the reports. The shift toward electric vehicles had hit them hard. Their outdated business model wasn't keeping up. Their loyal customers were aging out, and they hadn't evolved fast enough to capture the younger generation. The Gonzalez name, the thing they had once valued above me, was sinking, and now they needed a lifeline. I exhaled slowly, tapping my fingers against my glass. "Let me guess," I said. "You want me to help modernize the brand, bring in sustainable practices, capitalize on my influence?" Vanessa looked me dead in the eye. "Yes," I chuckled, shaking my head. "Amazing how fast 'you're not family' turns into 'we need you' when money's involved." My father bristled. "This isn't about money. It's about saving what we built." "What you built," I corrected. "You made sure I had no part in it." More silence. This time, no one had a counter-argument, because there wasn't one. Finally, Vanessa pushed a thick folder across the table. "We're offering you part ownership," she said, her voice carefully measured. "If you come on board, help us restructure, the business could survive." I looked down at the folder. I didn't reach for it. Instead, I let the moment stretch, watching them shift in their seats, waiting for my response. Then, finally, I exhaled. "Fine." 3 pairs of eyes snapped to mine. But I continued, "We do this on my terms." I slid the folder back to Vanessa. "I'll buy out controlling interest. Effective immediately." My father's expression hardened. That's not what we. Non-negotiable. I cut him off smoothly. Vanessa's brow furrowed. You want to own the company outright? No. I corrected, taking another sip of wine. I want to reinvent it. The Gonzalez name isn't worth saving anymore. The world is changing. Your brand isn't. My father's face darkened. Paul, the dealership, is dead. I finished for him. But I'm offering to turn it into something new. Sustainable luxury vehicles. High-end electric models. A new, environmentally responsible era of transportation. I let that sink in before adding. Under a new name, my mother's eyes widened slightly. You're rebranding? I nodded. Vanessa exhaled sharply, rubbing her temples. Jesus, Paul. My father's silence was the loudest of all. He had spent his life building the Gonzalez brand into something untouchable. And now he was watching me tear it down and rebuild it in my own image. Do we have a deal? I asked, raising a brow. They didn't have a choice. They never did. Finally, my father closed his eyes for a long moment, then gave a single nod. My mother swallowed thickly. Yes, she whispered. Vanessa exhaled. Fine. I smirked. Good, I said, pushing my chair back. Now, if you'll excuse me, I have somewhere to be. They blinked. You're leaving? Dinner's paid for, I said simply. Enjoy the meal. I grabbed my coat, smoothing the lapel as I turned to leave. But just before I walked away, I paused, glancing over my shoulder. You know, I said, voice light, casual. If you had supported me from the start, I would have helped you for free. My father's face barely flickered. I smiled, shaking my head. Too bad. Then I walked out. As I stepped outside, my phone buzzed again. Not my family this time. A business notification. A major order. Another retailer. Another deal. Another confirmation that I had built something greater than they ever imagined. I looked up at the night sky, inhaled deeply, and exhaled. For the first time in my life, I felt completely free. They thought cutting me off would break me. But all they had done was set me on the path to becoming untouchable. And now, they were the ones answering to me. I slid my phone back into my pocket and walked into the future. The transformation was swift and absolute. The moment the ink dried on the contract, the Gonzalez automotive legacy was dead. And in its place, something new was born. The first thing I did was gut the rot from the inside out. The old dealership executives, the ones who had built their careers on outdated business models and backroom deals, gone. The traditionalist board members who clung to my father's reputation like a life raft, gone. I cleaned house, replacing them with people who understood the future. Visionaries, engineers, designers who saw sustainability not as a trend, but as the next revolution. What had once been a dying empire of gas-guzzling machines became something sleek, cutting-edge. The showroom? Completely redesigned. Where there were once glossy posters of outdated sedans and SUVs, there were now fully electric luxury models, sleek, quiet powerhouses designed for the modern world. And amidst it all, my fingerprint was undeniable. Reclaimed wood countertops, lighting fixtures made from salvage materials, custom-designed seating areas built from repurposed steel and glass. Everywhere you looked, you could see it, proof that I had turned their rejection into something unstoppable. The launch event was a spectacle. Press swarmed the new showroom, snapping photos, filming interviews. The governor attended. Investors lined up, and my family, they watched from the sidelines. For the first time, they weren't the ones in control. Vanessa stood near the entrance, scanning the room like she was memorizing every detail. My mother sat in a quiet corner, sipping champagne, offering tight smiles to guests who complimented my work. My father? He was stiff, silent, hands clasped behind his back as he watched me shake hands with city officials, industry leaders, and customers who saw me as the future of sustainable luxury. He had spent his whole life commanding attention. But tonight, it was my name on everyone's lips. A week later, we had one last family meeting. This time, the setting was different. No more living room interventions. No more dimly lit rooms with papers shoved across the table. This time, we sat in the newly renovated corporate boardroom, my boardroom. And this time, I sat at the head of the table. My father sat to my left, Vanessa to my right. My mother sat silently, hands folded in her lap. They had given up control. But respect? That was something they had never handed out freely. I met each of their eyes, steady and calm. Finally, my father exhaled, sitting back. You built something impressive, he admitted. I let the words settle, but I didn't let them soften me. I had spent my whole life waiting for his approval. And now, I didn't need it. I nodded. I know. Vanessa tapped her pen against the table. Where do we go from here? The word wasn't lost on me. They had disowned me. And now, they were asking for a seat at my table. But not because they were entitled to it. Because I had built something too strong, too lucrative, too undeniable for them to ignore. I could have cut them out completely. I could have left them behind the way they had left me. But I wasn't doing this for them. I was doing it for me. For the kid who used to sit in that house, hands stained with sawdust, dreams too big for their world. For the man who had clawed his way up, built something with his own hands, and turned his pain into power. I leaned forward, folding my hands together. We move forward, I said. On my terms, a moment of silence. Then my father nodded, not just in agreement, in respect. For the first time in my life, he saw me not as a disappointment, not as an embarrassment, but as his equal. Maybe even more than that. I stood, buttoning my jacket, signaling that the meeting was over. As I turned to leave, my mother reached for my hand. She squeezed it just briefly, searching my face. I'm proud of you, she whispered. And for the first time, I believed her. As I stepped outside, I inhaled deeply, looking up at the building that now carried my name. Not his name, mine. Success isn't about proving them wrong. It's about proving myself right. I had done that, and now I was just getting started. As I stood outside my new headquarters, watching my name gleam under the lights, I realized something. I had done it. Not for them. Not to prove anything to the people who once wrote me off, but for myself. For the boy who once believed he wasn't good enough. For the man who refused to let rejection define him. Success had never been about revenge. It had never been about showing them what they had lost. It was about showing myself what I was capable of. I had built something real, something lasting, something that wasn't just about money or power, but about vision, resilience, and believing in what others couldn't see. So if you're watching this, if you've ever been told that your dreams are worthless, that your passion is a waste of time, that you will never make it without following someone else's path, I want you to hear this. They're wrong. You don't need their approval. You don't need their validation. What you need is to bet on yourself, to do the work, to push forward when no one believes in you, to stand up again and again until you are undeniable. Because one day, the same people who doubted you will see your name somewhere they never expected it. And by then, you won't need their recognition. You'll have something far greater, your own success. Now it's your turn. Tell me, have you ever had to prove someone wrong? Have you ever walked away from something toxic to build the life you deserve? Share your story in the comments. I'd love to hear it. And if this story spoke to you, if you know someone who needs to hear this, tag them. Send them this video. And before you go, don't forget to like and subscribe to AGS Stories. Because here, we tell the stories that remind you. You are stronger than they think. And you're just getting started.